After 17 years, this murder is still officially unsolved. But here's the part no one ever says out loud. The police were already close enough to touch the body, and they didn't find her. Not kilometers away, not deep in the bush. She was right there, and if that doesn't make you uncomfortable yet, it should, because once you understand where Simone Strobel's body was found, when it was found, and what decisions were made before that moment, you can't call this bad luck anymore. This wasn't a lack of evidence, it wasn't a lack of time, and it wasn't a lack of suspicion. It was a series of decisions that quietly took urgency off the table. And once that happened, everything else followed. 17 years later, there's a $1 million reward, sealed evidence, and police still saying the truth is being withheld. So here's the question Australians should be asking. How does a woman get murdered less than 100 meters from where she vanished, and an investigation still go nowhere? Stay with me, because the answer isn't what most people think. And it starts with a story that was accepted far too easily and never properly challenged. After 17 years, millions of dollars spent, multiple inquiries, international attention, and now a $1 million reward, the murder of Simone Strobel still leaves Australia with a question that should never have gone unanswered in the first place. How does a young woman disappear from a caravan park, get murdered less than 100 meters away, and remain unfound for days, while police are already searching for her? This isn't a story about bad luck or a lack of resources. It's not a mystery that was simply too complex to solve. This is a case that was allowed to drift slowly and quietly because of decisions made in the first crucial hours, decisions that were never properly revisited, decisions that shaped everything that came after. After years of silence, name changes, overseas disappearances, and carefully worded denials, the uncomfortable reality is this: the Simone Strobel investigation didn't stall because there were no clues. It stalled because the wrong assumptions were made early, and once those assumptions took hold, they were never seriously challenged. This matters, not just for Simone's family, but for every Australian who expects that when something goes wrong, especially when someone vanishes under suspicious circumstances, the system responds with urgency rather than comfort. Because what happened here wasn't urgency, it was hesitation. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from official records, sworn testimony, court findings, diary entries written before Simone disappeared, witness statements, and investigative reporting. This isn't speculation. It's a reconstruction of what was known, when it was known, and what was not done with that information. Simone Strobel was a 25-year-old German backpacker, a trained kindergarten teacher, described by friends and family as cautious, responsible, and emotionally grounded. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who took off without thinking things through. She was traveling Australia with her long-term boyfriend Tobias, his sister Katrin, and their friend Jens. Like thousands of backpackers before them, they were moving up and down the East Coast, staying at caravan parks, working short-term jobs, and socializing with other travelers. In February 2005, the group was staying at a caravan park in Lismore, New South Wales. It had been raining heavily for days. The weather had confined them to close quarters. Tensions were already present before the night Simone disappeared. That much is not in dispute, despite later denials. On the evening she vanished, the group went to a local pub. CCTV footage later showed them being asked to leave after a loud argument. This wasn't subtle. Staff remembered it clearly. Other patrons noticed it. It was heated enough that security intervened. Yet what happened next would become the first major fracture in the investigation. According to the account later given to police, the group returned to the campsite. Another argument occurred. Simone became upset and walked away to be alone. She left without shoes. She left without money. She left without her phone or her passport. She left in the rain, late at night, in a town she didn't know well, in a country that wasn't her own. And this is the point where everything should have changed, but didn't, because police were told she had stormed off, and that explanation was treated as plausible. It's worth stopping here, because this is where logic quietly left the room. When has a responsible adult ever done that overseas, at night in the rain, without basic belongings and simply not returned? Not after an hour, not after cooling down, but ever. The truth is, there are almost no comparable cases where that explanation stands up. Yet in Simone's case, it was accepted early enough to slow everything that followed. Simone was reported missing the next morning. The report didn't come from an independent witness or a campsite operator. It came from the people who had last been with her the night before, her boyfriend Tobias, his sister Katrin, and their friend Jens. By their own account, Simone had left during the night after an argument. They went to sleep. Hours passed. When morning came and Simone still hadn't returned, they conducted a brief search around the campsite and then contacted police. That detail matters more than it might seem. From the very beginning, the investigation relied almost entirely on the narrative provided by the last people to see Simone alive. There was no independent confirmation of her intentions, no evidence she planned to leave, no indication she had arranged transport, accommodation, or contact with anyone else. And yet the response that followed reflected a belief that this was a temporary disappearance. Police knew Simone had left everything behind. They knew she had no money, no identification, and no phone. They knew she was a foreign national. They also knew, despite later claims to the contrary, that arguments had occurred both at the pub and at the campsite. Still, the prevailing assumption was that she would return. That assumption set the pace. It influenced how resources were deployed. It shaped the tone of the investigation. Instead of treating Simone's disappearance as a high-risk event requiring immediate escalation, it was approached as a situation that might resolve itself. This wasn't a failure of compassion, it was a failure of judgment. Experienced investigators understand that when an adult disappears following an emotionally charged event, leaves behind critical belongings, and cannot be contacted, the risk of foul play increases significantly. That was true in 2005, just as it is today. Yet Simone's case was initially filtered through a familiar backpacker stereotype. The travelers drift, move on, or temporarily vanish. That stereotype did not fit the facts in front of them. While hours turned into days, rain continued to fall. The campsite remained active. People walked, drove, and camped in the same areas. Potential scent trails degraded. Foot traffic contaminated the scene. Witness memories began to blur. Every hour that passed under the assumption that Simone would turn up quietly reduced the chances of preserving the evidence that could explain why she never did. And then came the moment that would haunt this investigation forever. When Simone's body was finally found, it wasn't kilometers away in dense bushland. It wasn't hidden deep in the outback. It was approximately 90 meters from where she disappeared. Her body had been placed on a bocce court, partially concealed with palm fronds, behind a fence, in an area accessible to people moving through the park. Police had been searching. People had been walking past. Life had continued. And Simone had already been there. That discovery didn't just shock the community, it exposed a deeper problem, because the question wasn't how she ended up there. The question was how she wasn't found sooner. And once you start asking that question honestly, the entire investigation begins to unravel. What makes Simone Strobel's case so unsettling isn't just that her body was found close to where she disappeared. It's what that discovery quietly confirms about everything that went wrong before it. Because once you accept that Simone was there the entire time, the investigation can no longer hide behind distance, terrain, or bad luck. This wasn't a case where searchers were just unlucky. This was a case where the wrong areas were prioritized, the wrong assumptions guided decisions, and urgency arrived too late. One of the most troubling details is when police finally brought in sniffer dogs. Not on the first night, not the following morning when Simone failed to return, but on the very day her body was found. By then, days of rain had fallen. Foot traffic had moved through the area. Campers had come and gone. Any viable scent trail had been degraded almost beyond usefulness. Sniffer dogs are not a last resort in high-risk disappearances. They are meant to be one of the first tools deployed. In Simone's case, they were treated as optional. That delay mattered because scent dogs don't just help find missing people, they help establish movement, direction, timelines. They can confirm whether someone walked away on their own or was transported. They can identify whether a body was moved after death. All of that information was effectively lost before it was even sought. And then there's the location itself. Simone's body was found on a bocce court, partially concealed with palm fronds. To reach that spot, investigators later concluded her body would have had to be moved through or over a chain-link fence. This wasn't a simple lift and drop. It required effort, it required time, and it raised a critical question almost immediately. Was this done by one person or more than one? That question alone should have radically reshaped the investigation. Because if more than one person was involved, then the idea of a random, opportunistic attack becomes far less likely. It points instead toward planning, cooperation, or at the very least, assistance. Yet this possibility sat largely unexplored for years, buried beneath procedural delays and jurisdictional complications. At the fence, a single strand of blonde hair was found. At the time, forensic technology could not extract DNA from a hair without a root. It was logged, preserved, and then, effectively, shelved. Years later, that same piece of evidence would be revisited as testing methods improved, but by then, the damage was done. The early window, when physical evidence has its greatest value, had closed. What also became increasingly clear was that witness accounts did not match the version of events police were initially given. Campers nearby reported hearing arguments late at night. One witness claimed to have heard a woman screaming around 2 o'clock in the morning. Others recalled raised voices coming from the direction of Simone's campsite well after she was said to have stormed off. These statements were not fringe claims. They were given formally, and yet they did not meaningfully alter the early trajectory of the case. At the same time, CCTV footage from the pub showed something else entirely. It showed Simone and her companions being ejected after a heated argument. Staff remembered it clearly. Security intervened. This wasn't a quiet disagreement. Yet in later statements, that argument was downplayed, reframed, and in some cases denied outright. Police were left with two competing realities, one recorded on camera and confirmed by witnesses, the other asserted by the people closest to Simone. This is where many investigations either recover or collapse. When accounts conflict, pressure must be applied early, questions must be repeated, timelines must be tested while memories are still fresh. Instead, what followed in Simone's case was a gradual retreat into silence. Within months, key individuals stopped cooperating, lawyers were engaged, statements became carefully worded or ceased entirely. Contact with Simone's family was cut off. That silence was legally permissible, but it had investigative consequences, because once cooperation ends, time becomes the defense. Evidence degrades. Witnesses move on. Public attention fades, and here's the part that deserves serious reflection. Years later, when an inquest was finally held, the coroner named Simone's boyfriend and his sister as persons of interest. The coroner stated plainly that there was enough suspicion surrounding them that warranted deeper examination. But that examination could not happen because they refused to appear. They were overseas, and they could not be compelled. One witness did appear, the fourth member of the group, and his testimony added another disturbing layer. He told the court that Tobias had urged them all to get their story straight, that they should say certain things, that they should avoid mentioning others. That detail alone should have triggered immediate alarm. Coordinated narratives don't appear in accidents. They appear when people are afraid of what the truth might reveal. From that moment on, the case entered a long, quiet freeze. Years passed. Simone's family waited. Appeals were made, rewards were offered, and eventually, the man at the center of it all disappeared again, this time to South Africa. There, he lived openly under a modified identity. He ran surf lessons at a backpacker's lodge. He told people elaborate stories about his past, claiming to be a former football star, claiming to have grown up in Australia, claiming a life that simply didn't exist. Locals later said he built a private memorial to Simone deep in a forest, far from the official site in Lismore. He visited it regularly. He prayed, he sang, he drank there. He wore a necklace linked to the last photograph ever taken of Simone. None of this is evidence of guilt on its own, but taken together, it paints a picture that is, at the very least, deeply unsettling. When an investigative journalist eventually confronted him, calling him by his real name and asking why he refused to give evidence, he fled. He left the lodge, he vanished again, and despite publicly declaring he would never return to Australia, he eventually did. He changed his surname. He married. He settled in Perth. Time almost won. Almost, because when he later sued an author for defamation, the court ruled against him. The judgment stated there was reasonable suspicion in reporting his involvement. That wasn't tabloid commentary. That was a legal finding. So here we are. 17 years later, a $1 million reward, evidence sealed, DNA re-examined, another inquest promised then postponed. And I want to ask you something, and don't brush this off. If Simone Strobel were your daughter, your sister, or your partner, and you learned her body had been less than 100 meters away the entire time, and that sniffer dogs were brought in only after she was found, and that key people refused to answer questions and then built new lives elsewhere, would you accept that this was just an unfortunate series of mistakes? Or would you call it what it looks like, a system that failed when it mattered most? I want to hear your answer, not a yes or no. Tell me in the comments, what moment in this case crossed the line for you? For Simone's parents, the years that followed were not just years without answers. They were years of watching opportunities close. Every anniversary passed with the same unresolved question hanging in the air. How could so much time pass when the circumstances were so clear? They weren't asking for miracles. They were asking for momentum, for pressure, for someone somewhere in the system to say, this doesn't add up and we're not letting it go. Instead, what they saw was drift. The investigation never formally collapsed. That's important to understand. It didn't end with a press conference announcing failure. It simply slowed. Files grew thicker, leads grew thinner, and responsibility became diffuse. When no single decision is acknowledged as wrong, no one is accountable for the outcome. This is where Simone Strobel's case begins to resemble a pattern that older Australians have seen before, not just once, but repeatedly. Backpackers, remote or semi-remote locations, partners present, arguments beforehand, a disappearance explained away as emotional behavior, and then, slowly, the investigation loses its edge. Think back to the Peter Falconio case. Joanne Lees survived, but for years, Australians argued over whether she was telling the truth. Early assumptions shaped public and police perception alike. Or Lindy Chamberlain, where institutional certainty replaced open inquiry, and it took years to unwind what should never have been set in stone. Different cases, different outcomes, but the same underlying danger. Once authorities decide what probably happened, everything else is filtered through that lens. In Simone's case, the lens was set early. She walked off. She needed space. She would return. And even when the evidence contradicted that idea, the body location, the fence, the hair, the screams, the investigation never fully recalibrated. It adjusted around the edges, but it never snapped into the kind of aggressive, uncompromising posture these cases demand. One of the most damaging aspects was how time was allowed to become neutral rather than the enemy. Every year that passed without charges was treated as unfortunate but inevitable. Yet time doesn't just pass in murder investigations, it actively erodes them. Witnesses forget small but crucial details. People who might once have spoken decide it's safer not to. Jurisdictional barriers harden. Extradition becomes politically complicated. And eventually, silence begins to look like stability. For Simone's family, silence was anything but stable. It was corrosive. They watched as people who had been at the center of their daughter's final hours withdrew completely. They watched as contact was cut off. They watched as cooperation turned into carefully managed absence. And perhaps most painful of all, they watched as life appeared to move on, for everyone except them. There is a moment in cases like this when the public often pulls back. People tell themselves that if nothing has happened by now, it probably never will. That belief is understandable, but it's dangerous because it rewards exactly the behavior that stalls justice. Keep quiet, wait it out, let time do the work. And yet, despite everything, this case never fully disappeared. Investigators continued to say, quietly but consistently, that the truth was being withheld, that people knew more than they were saying, that Simone's death did not make sense as a random act. When rewards were increased, first by German authorities, then dramatically by New South Wales police, it was an admission, even if unspoken, that earlier efforts had not been enough. The $1 million reward wasn't just about money. It was a signal, a statement that the case was not closed, not forgotten, and not resolved. It was also an acknowledgement that the answers would not come easily because the normal mechanisms had failed. And that brings us to the hardest question of all, one that sits uncomfortably beneath every page of this investigation. If police had treated Simone's disappearance as high risk from the first hour, if sniffer dogs had been deployed immediately, if the campsite had been locked down sooner, if contradictions had been confronted aggressively before lawyers intervened, if key individuals had been compelled to account for themselves while memories were fresh, would we still be here, nearly 2 decades later? That question isn't about blaming individual officers on the ground. It's about systems, about protocols, about the cultural instinct to avoid escalation until escalation is unavoidable. By the time it was unavoidable in Simone's case, the damage was already done. What makes this especially difficult to accept is that none of these failures were dramatic on their own. No single moment screams incompetence. Instead, it's a chain of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that together produced a devastating result. That is how investigations fail quietly, not with a bang, but with a shrug. And so, Simone Strobel's case sits in that uncomfortable space Australians know too well. Not officially unsolved because no one cares, but unsolved because the window where truth could be forced open was allowed to close. Before we go further, I want you to pause and think about this, not as a viewer of true crime, but as someone who lives in this country. If this had happened in your town, if the caravan park was one you'd driven past 100 times, if the people involved had gone on to change names, move states, and build new lives, would you still be satisfied with how this was handled, or would you be asking why? In a case where so many warning signs were visible so early, accountability still feels so far away. Because in the final stretch, we're going to confront the question that police themselves keep circling but have never publicly answered. Not who killed Simone Strobel, but why the system never forced the truth into the open when it had the chance. And that's where this case stops being just about one young woman and starts being about all of us. At some point, every unresolved case reaches a fork in the road. One path leads toward resolution, however uncomfortable that may be. The other leads toward institutional quiet, a place where files remain technically open, but nothing really moves. Simone Strobel's case drifted down that second path, not because people stopped caring, but because the system never forced a reckoning when it still could. What makes this especially difficult to accept is that investigators themselves have repeatedly signaled that they don't believe the full truth has ever been told. Senior officers have said, on the record, that people are withholding information. Rewards have been raised. Evidence has been retested. Hearings have been scheduled and then postponed. All of that tells us something important. This is not a case that went cold due to a lack of suspicion. It went cold because suspicion alone is not enough. Suspicion without pressure is just noise. And pressure in cases like this has to come early. It has to come before stories harden, before lawyers enter the picture, before people cross borders, change names, and rebuild their lives beyond reach. Once that happens, the balance of power shifts permanently away from investigators and toward those who benefit from silence. This is where institutional culture matters. Police are trained to avoid tunnel vision, and rightly so. But there is a difference between open-mindedness and hesitation. In Simone's case, the fear of getting it wrong appears to have outweighed the risk of doing nothing. And doing nothing, in the early stages of a murder investigation, is not neutral. It actively advantages the person responsible. There is also an uncomfortable reality about how society views backpackers and travelers. They are often seen as transient, temporary, and rootless. When something happens to them, especially far from home, the urgency can soften. There is no local political pressure, no electorate demanding answers. Families are overseas. Media interest fades faster. Simone Strobel, for all the love she inspired, did not belong to a powerful constituency. That shouldn't matter, but it does. Contrast that with cases where victims are local, well-connected, or politically visible. Resources move faster, statements are sharper, timelines are tighter. In Simone's case, the distance, geographic and cultural, made it easier for the investigation to slow without consequence. And then there is the issue no one likes to talk about openly, the legal shield of silence. Everyone involved in Simone's final hours exercised their right not to speak. That right exists for good reasons. But when investigators fail to extract critical information before silence descends, justice becomes almost impossible to achieve later. Silence doesn't just block answers. It reshapes the entire evidentiary landscape. Years later, when courts acknowledged there was reasonable suspicion, it was both validating and devastating. Validating because it confirmed that the doubts were not imagined. Devastating because by then, the mechanisms to act on that suspicion were blunt, slow, and constrained. Simone's parents have lived with that contradiction for years. On one hand, authorities telling them they believe the truth is being hidden. On the other, no charges, no trial, no resolution. That limbo is its own form of punishment. It's a life spent waiting for something that may never arrive, and so we're left with the question that sits at the heart of this case, and many like it. If the system acknowledges failure quietly but never publicly examines it, what actually changes? What stops the next case from following the same path? Because Simone Strobel's story is not unique. It fits into a broader pattern of investigations where early assumptions become permanent obstacles, where caution overrides urgency, where time becomes an ally of silence, and where accountability is diffused until it effectively disappears. This isn't about rewriting history, it's about learning from it, honestly. about admitting that good intentions are not enough when decisions in the first 24 hours can determine whether a case is solved in months or lost for decades. So I want to leave you with this, and I genuinely want you to answer it. If you were designing the system from scratch, knowing what you now know about Simone's case, what would you change first? Is it mandatory early escalation, stronger powers to compel testimony, faster cross-border cooperation, or a cultural shift that treats silence as a warning, not a neutral choice? Tell me in the comments what you think failed the most here, the people, the process, or the priorities. Because until that question is answered honestly, Simone Strobel's case won't just remain unresolved, it will remain a warning. And if we ignore it, we shouldn't be surprised when it happens again. At this point, it should be clear why the Simone Strobel investigation is still failing and why no one involved wants to admit it. It isn't because there were no clues. It isn't because the case was too complex. And it certainly isn't because no one tried. It's failing because the most important decisions were made when everyone thought there was still time. And by the time it became obvious there wasn't, the system had already given away its advantage. The early assumption that Simone simply walked off into the night shaped everything. It slowed urgency, it delayed resources, it allowed critical evidence to fade. That single idea, convenient, familiar, and largely unchallenged, became the foundation on which the entire investigation rested. And when that foundation cracked, everything built on top of it became unstable. Once silence set in, it hardened. Once borders were crossed, they stayed crossed. Once names were changed and lives rebuilt, the cost of reopening the past grew higher with every year, not just legally, but politically and institutionally. Because reopening the case in any meaningful way would require acknowledging that something went wrong early. And that is a conversation systems rarely want to have. That's the part no one likes to say out loud. Investigations don't just fail because of criminals. They fail because of hesitation, deference, and the quiet hope that time will sort things out. In Simone's case, time did the opposite. It protected silence, it rewarded non-cooperation, and it left a family waiting while the world moved on. This is not about presuming guilt. It's about recognizing patterns Australians have seen before: a disappearance after an argument, a delayed response, conflicting accounts, a narrowing circle of people who know what happened, and a system that never quite pushes hard enough to force the truth into the open. If you're wondering why this case still feels unresolved, it's because accountability has never been fully applied, not to individuals and not to the process itself. Until that happens, no reward amount, no new testing, no future inquest will deliver the clarity everyone claims to want. And that's why this investigation is still failing. Not quietly, not accidentally, but predictably. Before you go, I want you to sit with one final question. I want an honest answer. If this had been your daughter, if her body had been found meters from where she vanished, if people closest to her refused to answer questions and went on to live new lives, would you accept that this is as far as the system can go, or would you expect more? If you think this case deserves real accountability, say so in the comments. If you think something fundamental went wrong, name it. And if you don't want cases like this quietly fading into permanent limbo, make sure you're subscribed. Because the only thing worse than an unsolved case is one everyone pretends can't be solved. And Simone Strobel deserved better than that. For years, officials said this case failed because there wasn't enough evidence. In 2025, that changed. Because under oath in open court, the system finally acknowledged something very different, that the investigation didn't just stall, it was derailed. And once you see how that happened, you'll understand why this case has never truly moved forward.